Welcome, everybody, to this special webinar. This is part of a series we are hosting to highlight the key topics published through our Social Inclusion Journal throughout the last year. And today's session is centered around the thematic issue, the global disappearance of decent work, precarity, exploitation, and work-based harms in the neoliberal era. Each presentation will have roughly 15 minutes, and before we get things started, I just want to give a quick rundown of the structure of the session to everybody, and then we can kick off with presentations. So firstly, we'll have introduction of this thematic issue by academic editor Bob Jeffery. We'll move on to our first paper presentation of the day by Shewly and Ellen. They are presenting their article, Hyper-Precarious Lives, Understanding Migration, Global Supply Chain, and Gender Dynamics in Bangladesh. Onwards, we'll move on to Iveta Ķešāne, Sociological Types of Precarity Among Gig Workers, Lived Experiences of Food Delivery Workers in Riga. And last but not least, Peter Thomas, who is joining us alongside Bob Jeffery. They're in the same room together, who will be giving us some discussant comments on the presented papers and the broader themes of the issue ahead of opening up our discussion in the Q&A section. How does the Q&A section work? So throughout the entire webinar, you are free to leave your questions in the dedicated Q&A chat box, which should be somewhere around here. Please do not confuse it with the main chat in which you are already writing in, because it makes it easier to collect all the questions and then pose them to each speaker in this section. Also, please specify which speaker you want to address your question to, if that's the case, because it makes it easier to organize. Just before we start, I have a couple more information. So this webinar is being recorded. We have that question already in the chat. So yes, this webinar will be up on YouTube shortly after the session is over. We will also share today's presentations with you all after the session for you to have a read if you want to. And lastly, you can read all the articles presented in this webinar, as well as the entire thematic issue with all the other articles included in it in full open access on the Social Inclusion website. So without further ado, let's kick this off with Bob Jeffery, Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the Sheffield Hallam University and academic editor of the issue in which this webinar is centered around. So Bob, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen with us.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. Okay, I'll just share my slides. Hopefully everyone can see those. Fantastic. So yeah, my name is Dr. Bob Jeffery. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at Sheffield Hallam University, and one of the editors of this special issue, Precarity, the global disappearance of decent work, precarity, exploitation, and work-based harms in the neoliberal era. So in this introduction, I'm going to give a little bit of background to the special issue, talk about some key concepts and the critique of those concepts, and set out really the scope of the contributions that were included in the special issue. So first of all, just in terms of background, the special issue was coordinated and supported by members of a network, the Injustice International Network. So that was myself at Sheffield Hallam, Mustafa Sheikh at the University of Leeds, and Adam Formby at the University of York. The network has been around for about 10 years, and it brings together academics, policymakers, activists, NGO, third sector organisations who are all interested in various questions of social justice and injustice, and bringing forward debates about how we affect progressive change in the world. The network was founded by Simon Prideaux, who was an assistant professor at the University of Leeds. His interventions on diverse topics, disability policy, state crime, and political ideology have had and continue to have significant impact across a range of disciplines. Simon sadly passed away in August 2023, and this special issue is dedicated to his memory. So I want to start off by defining a little bit what we mean by precarity. So uncertainty, lack of stability, Guy Standing famously described this in terms of life without the anchor of stability. The term really entered academia through French studies of poverty, including some of the work of Pierre Bourdieu. And here precarity was used to describe poor quality, low-skilled jobs, not contractual insecurity per se. So it was a kind of broader notion of precarity and the subjective experiences of being in a precarious situation, to do with not just to do with employment, but to do with housing and to do with poverty as well. Now, in the last 15 years, it's gained increasing traction, the term, within the sociology of work and employment, and indeed has entered the popular lexicon. In Britain, it was used in a famous study of social class about 10 years ago to define one of the supposed new social classes in contemporary Britain. But as it's been increasingly used within the sociology of work and employment, its usage has tended to be narrowed somewhat, to focus more on questions of contractual insecurity. So in Britain, it's things like zero-hour contracts, fixed-term contracts, bogus self-employment, the rise of the gig economy. At the same time, there's a tension because a lot of the key authors, including Standing himself, use the term to refer to a variety of employment conditions, not simply contracts, but also pay, employment regulation or lack thereof, lack of inspections, lack of enforcement, right down to conditions within particular economic sectors. So, I mean, this really kind of leads us on to thinking about how we can critically engage with the concept of precarity. As Ķešāne has argued, Joseph Ķešāne, and I think I would join him in this, there is the danger of an extraordinary conflation of disparate categories when we use the term precarity. Are we referring simply to contractual status? Are we referring to other things? Secondly, I think there's a tendency when we define precarity to reify a relatively brief period in Euro-American capitalism, the era of the so-called standard employment relationship, which really persists from the Second World War through to the early 1970s. But that brief period in the global north where secure employment was the norm, at least for native-born people and at least for men. So even within that brief period, women and migrants tended to be excluded from the so-called standard employment relationship. But when we draw our view out on a more macro level and we look across the planet, actually what we now call precarious work has been the dominant situation for most people in most countries throughout the history of modernity. I think thirdly, and perhaps somewhat paradoxically, we can also question the extent to which precarity is increasing. So Ķešāne again has extensively documented this, at least here in Britain, and has noted that we do get significant increases in contractual insecurity in the 1980s and the early 1990s, but thereafter the situation tends to stabilize. And that's led himself, but others, Jane Hardy, Charles Umney, to argue that when people feel that precarity is increasing, at least in Britain and perhaps of the global north countries, they're not simply referring to contractual insecurity, they're referring to the wider gamut of employment terms and conditions. So there's an argument here that perhaps the concept of precarity is being stretched too far and it's been asked to do too much. A number of authors, myself and Peter included, have advanced an alternative framework that we describe as work-based harms, a kind of more multifaceted way of approaching the full gamut of employment conditions. We did kind of pitch that to contributors in the original call for papers. There wasn't much take-up, it has to be noted, but it is a very new term kind of emerging from critical criminology, but perhaps that's something we can bring out in terms of the discussion. Now turning to the special issue itself. I mean, I think firstly, I want to draw attention to the geographical scope of the special issue. So as noted, a lot of studies of precarity tend to be focused in the global north, even within that the United States and Western Europe. I think it's a real virtue of this special issue that we have all of these different experiences represented, from Bangladesh to Ecuador, from Finland to Jordan. I think accompanying that, what we have is really diverging political economies. So neoliberalism is clearly a common thread throughout all of the contributions in this special issue, processes of neoliberalization as they've unfolded over the last 3 or 4 decades. But what the special issue shows, or the range of contributions shows, is these play out in very different ways in those countries undergoing post-socialist transitions in China, Czechia and Latvia, those countries in the global south where markets are being opened through structural adjustment and neoliberal trade policies, Bangladesh and Ecuador, for example, through to the increasing number of exceptions that we see in what were formerly heavily regulated labour markets in places like Finland and Spain. As well as the diversity of geography and political economies, the special issue also has a real diversity of methods. We have an article that uses discourse analysis to look at how self-employment is constructed within the political discourse in the Parliament of Czechia. We have ethnographic observations of Venezuelan migrant workers in Ecuador, and qualitative interviews with tea plantations in Assam, in northeast India, and indeed in other contributions, including the 2 that we're going to hear from a bit more later in this webinar. We also have a real eclectic mix of theorizations, but I wanted to draw attention to 4 approaches that were either particularly dominant across the various contributions or particularly novel. We had theoretical perspectives that focused on the question of subjectivity. How does precariousness feel? How is it experienced? A lot of that work drawing on the ideas of Judith Butler and Pierre Bourdieu. We had contributions that looked at the ideology, which is driving new forms of precarity or flexibility, depending upon the ideological dint you want to give it, drawing on Boltanski and Capello's New Spirit of Capitalism. We have attempts to spatialize precarity and to look at how precariousness is constructed through the physical environment, through constructions of space and place. And then I think particularly dominant across quite a number of contributions was this focus on neoliberal governance using the work of Mazadra and Nielsen, looking at how the proliferation of neoliberal governance structures in the contemporary era have served to carve up social and political space, multiplying differences between citizen, guest worker, resident, all of these different visa categories, pitting these different categories of workers against one another and increasing intensifying labour for all. So finally, in terms of wrapping up this introduction, I wanted to pose some questions in terms of the papers that we're going to hear from today, but also the contribution, the special issue more generally. I think the first is around the extent to which the ideological flip side of precarity, flexibility might actually be welcomed by workers, and which workers. We're going to be hearing from Iveta shortly, and in her paper, they identify groups where flexibility is made to work for them, and they can evade the kind of neoliberal injunction to live an entrepreneurial lifestyle, or they can balance family and caring commitments. But I wonder, can we say more about what determines whether flexibility is experienced as a benefit or a trap? Is it simply a question of demographics, of nationality? What other structural factors can we identify? And then I think, secondly, it's around the extent to which workers can contest precarity, and what are the barriers to contesting precarity. So a lot of the papers, and I think people are describing the situations as they found them, but a lot of the papers seem to suggest that resistance is futile. It will simply be met with by retaliation, or it's impossible. People's subjectivities, people feel frozen. There's a trauma response in terms of the experience of precarity. Shewly et al., who we will also obviously hear from in just a moment, was one of the very few articles in the special issue to even refer to labour unions and to organising workers. And they did so in terms of noting the challenges around organising in the context of an abundant oversupply of labour. But I want to pose a question: what more can we say about the potentialities and the barriers for worker resistance? And I will leave it there. We have a fantastic special issue, a fantastic collection of papers, and I'm particularly delighted at the two papers that have been picked out for discussion today. So I will hand back over to Jose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for this lovely introduction as well. Let's kick this off then, our paper presentations. I'll ask Hosna Shewly, Research Fellow at the Department of Anthropology of the University of Amsterdam and the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at VU Amsterdam, joined by Ellen Bull, Associate Professor at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, who will present their article, Hyper-Precarious Lives, Understanding Migration, Global Supply Chain and Gender Dynamics in Bangladesh. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for organizing this online meeting and for giving us the opportunity to share some of our research findings with you. As you already said, my name is Ellen Bull, and I worked closely together with Hosna Shewly, Jahan Shewly, and also Dr. Runa Laila, who could not be present today. Shewly, who is present, will be co-presenting with me and follow up. So in our presentation, we focus on the ready-made garments industry in Bangladesh, a sector that plays a crucial role in shaping Bangladesh's economy. This sector is not only the backbone of its economy, but also a key player on the global stage. Even amidst the disruptions caused by the pandemic, Bangladesh maintained its position as the second largest apparel exporter in both 2020 and 2021. For example, in the fiscal year 21-22, the RMG sector contributed more than 80% of the country's total exports. This clearly demonstrates how heavily this nation relies on this industry as primary source of foreign income. In our article, we take a step beyond the economic factors, numbers, and focus on the people who power this industry, particularly the women who form the majority of the workforce. The RMG sector is often praised for providing job opportunities to economically disadvantaged rural migrant women, many of whom have limited education. However, a substantial gender gap persists. Women typically start in lower positions as helpers and undergo months of training before becoming sewing machine operators in the factories. With experience, some advance to supervisory roles, but only few. In contrast, men often enter the industry in better paid positions with greater authority, such as supervisors, managers, or specialized roles in cutting, finishing, and machine maintenance. This disparity is not just about wages or job titles. It also exposes women to gender-based violence and inequalities, both within and outside the factories. Many female workers experience inadequate compensation, unpaid overtime, and limited opportunities for career progression. Yet, much of the research on Bangladesh's RMG sector tends to focus on overall precarious working conditions and overlook the gendered aspects of this issue. The research we are presenting today is based on extensive ethnographic studies and aims to fill this gap. Through many dozens of in-depth interviews and participatory action research conducted between 2016 and 2018, followed by additional interviews in 2020, 23, and 24, we explored the lived experiences of female RMG workers across Dhaka and Ghazipur. The study was part of a broader project on young female migration, livelihoods, and their sexual and reproductive rights. My colleagues Runa Laila and Hosna Shewly conducted the largest part of the ethnographic research. The participants in our study were diverse, including unmarried, married, widowed, and separated women, as well as individuals from ethnic minority groups, such as Garo and Chakma communities. Their ages ranged from 15 to 45, and they migrated from environmentally stressed regions outside Dhaka, the capital city of Bangladesh, such as regions that are facing riverbank erosion and flooding, or from drought-prone northern Bangladesh, and the indigenous communities, such as Garos and Chakmas, who we also included, also come from economically impoverished areas in the central north and southeast of the country. Despite their differences, all these women migrants shared a common goal: escaping severe financial struggles. Many divorced and separated women moved to cities to escape social stigma, the lack of rural job opportunities, and financial desperation. Unlike previous family migrations, most of these women moved alone in search of work, as migration is still considered a last resort for women in many families. Their primary motivation was not independence, but rather economic survival. To better understand the challenges these women are facing, we have introduced the concept of hyper-precarious life. This refers to the deeply uncertain conditions created by intersecting power dynamics, such as cultural norms, economic pressures, and a lack of social protection. Hyperprecarity means living with a sense of disposability, with no safety net, and an inability to secure a stable future for oneself or one's family. Our research argues that precarity is not just an isolated issue. It is constructed through the interplay of market forces, government policies, and family structures. The state also plays a pivotal role in shaping these dynamics, influencing class, gender, and ethnic disparities. To further unpack this, we used a holistic approach and began the paper by referring to the work of Mark Anner. He explains how global trade regulations, technological advancements, and financialization have intensified power imbalances in the global supply chain. According to him, two key mechanisms contribute to this. He refers to the price squeeze and the sourcing squeeze. The price squeeze occurs when buyers negotiate aggressively with suppliers, driving the costs down. The source squeeze, on the other hand, involves reduced lead times, fluctuating order sizes, and last-minute product changes. Together, these pressures create excessive workloads, unpaid overtime, workplace bullying, and standard factory conditions, all of which further exploit workers, and in particular, women. So the RMG sector remains vital for Bangladesh, but its success comes at a human cost. Women continue to face systematic discrimination, financial hardship, and workplace exploitation. Hereafter, Shewly will continue our presentation by highlighting two interrelated aspects of hyperprecarity in the RMG sector. The first relates to health and well-being of female workers. It's about understanding how extreme work conditions affect their physical and mental health. And secondly, she will talk about the socio-cultural power dynamics and analyze the interactions of gender, ethnicity, and economic status within the workplace and everyday life. Shewly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I just begin with health and well-being impacted by the work. Here it's more about like the work precarity extends its impact to encompass issues such as nutrition, break time for meals and drinks, which is also came in one of the story here. It's like drinking more water means frequent bathroom breaks, which means behind the production targets, resulting repercussion from the supervisors. So they drink only when they are extremely thirsty. This came repeatedly during our field research. But beyond these things, it is also has a kind of ethnic minority workers frequently experience more about derogatory remarks about their food during the lunchtime, which is even worse for them. And particularly the factory work load and work speed affects the general and reproductive health, and also put them in a kind of struggle for balancing work, health, and motherhood issues. But also the long work hours with overtime affect their access to healthcare. So they often resort to go to the local pharmacies for healthcare needs, including their reproductive health related matters. So, and then they also sometimes, when they decide for urgent issues or like emergency health cares, to go to the health clinics, societal taboos force them, many, to skip their work for unpaid rather than sick leave, even from female supervisors, to avoid scrutiny, especially for the young unmarried women. But for the pregnant workers, it's even differently affect them. So it is not only enduring prolonged sitting or standing discomfort in seeking repeated restroom breaks from the male supervisors, work pressure, but it is also barriers to maternity benefits, causing them immense stress, not only in their body, but also for their mental health. So maternity health, maternity leave policies varies across factories. While it's 4 months officially provided, many women reported they are receiving 3 months and 20 days of maternity leave, 52 days before and 52 days after the childbirth. So, for example, here we have a story from Rohima, who found herself in a position where she had to work until 8 months into her pregnancy to qualify for maternity benefits. But then, because of her health complication, she needed to have a premature birth at 7 months, so which resulted at the denial of half her maternity leave and benefits. And it is also in the story here with the Sabina, the anxiety that they have during the pregnancy, that if I fail to meet the production target, that means I'm losing my job. That means all the maternity benefits going to go away from us. So all these things really affect them. And then once they become mother, it is also another issue of securing childcare, because they come back to work just 52 days after their childbirth, while the childcare service starts for the kids who are 6 months older. So there is a gap in between, which required them having their own arrangement through the families and other ways. There are also concerns over quality and safety for the childcare support, specifically after the tragic Rana Plaza event. So they are not really feeling it's very comfortable ways of doing that. So now I move on to how the sociocultural norms and gender roles affect female workers inside and outside the workflow. We divide it into 3 segments. So the first is the gender disparity in job hierarchy and socioeconomic advancement. So it is like the cultural expectations about the woman's gendered role back at home is something not only affect them for progressing at the workplaces, but also sometimes it's considered their supervisor roles. It's more like manly job. Role demands not only higher education, other kinds of skills, but it also require mobility and interaction with many male colleagues, and also extended hours at night, which also causes security concerns for many, especially for the ethnic minority workers, not only at the workplace security, but also going home on the way, the harassment during the commutes. And also extended work hours clash with women's traditional household works, limiting their upward mobilities. But it is also the psychological issues related to societal norms about thinking whether their work is a temporary aspect. Then it's thinking about their prospect at workplaces. And then it also brings the issue of the double burden of paid and unpaid work. The story here mentions like during the peak seasons, it's very quite demanding work, starting from 5 o'clock early in the morning, having the shower and then preparation, meals, and shared households where they do not have enough facilities only for themselves. So it is also sharing the cooking at the same time, coming back home after long overtime at the midnight and then eating those things. So they're also mentioning a lot about having a lot of work at home and outside home. But it also brings the issue of the good omen and bad omen aspects of the society into the workflows. So we heard stories of pregnancy outside of marriage often results in job termination, reinforcing gender norms within the factories. So to conclude, combining what Ellen said and then the other parts, the empirical parts that are discussed here. So we think by situating precarity within local, national, and transnational scales, shaped by global north and south dynamics. This paper preaches the precarious work and precarious life approaches. It shows how global supply chains and socioeconomic structures create precarity for female workers through wage disparities, time constraints, and sociocultural pressures, demonstrating that precarity is multidimensional and interconnected. Using hyper-precarity, the article captures the profound uncertainty stemming from intersecting power dynamics marked by disposability, lack of protection, and barriers to a decent life, disproportionately affecting women. An intersectional lens reveals how gender, ethnicity, age, marital status, and social norms compound these vulnerabilities. It also shows that the role of capitalist dynamics and state-business-labor relations in shaping precarity. And to end, we call for more further research on the intersections of ethnicity, migration, and precarity within and beyond the R&D sector, particularly in the underexplored Global South, to better understand the challenges of female migrant workers. Thank you. I end.
Thank you so much, Shewly and Ellen, for this presentation. Let's move on to our next presenter and our next article. I'll introduce Iveta Ķešāne, Associate Professor at the Department of Cultural Sociology and Management at the Latvian Academy of Culture and co-author of the article Sociological Types of Precarity Among Gig Workers, Lived Experiences of Food Delivery Workers in Riga. Iveta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting. So can you see the presentation? All is well? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Iveta, and I'm one of the co-authors of the study, and I did this study together with my colleague Maya Spuriņa, and today I will try to explicate what's in the study. So the central question we ask, or the central questions we ask in our study is, given the precarious nature of gig work, we examine why people engage in it. And second, we also ask what are experiences of gig work and precarity associated with the platform economy in Latvia, a country that has undergone a radical neoliberalization. It is well documented in the literature that neoliberalism tends to worsen the condition of workers due to the dismantling of the welfare state, casualization and flexibilization of labor. And scholars indicate that the gig economy has brought neoliberal ideology and precarious working conditions to their extremes, since workers are expected to bear all the risks of markets and lack regulatory protection. At the same time, algorithmic management limits workers' ability to control their work conditions, adding to their lived experience of precarity. In our study, we primarily were interested in the lived experience of precarity of Latvian food delivery gig workers. And in a sense, following what Bob already explained, to understand the notion of precarity, we rely on Butlers and Miller, who distinguished between precariousness as an ontological condition in a sense that we all come into our lives as precarious creatures, and precarity as a condition that affects our precariousness in specific ways. For example, neoliberalism can be seen as one such condition that affects workers' lives in specific ways through ideology, welfare, and labor policies. Considering the structural realities of precarity, neoliberal transformations in post-Soviet Latvia have generated, we specifically explore the subjective experiences of gig workers in Latvia. And as Hermano and Miller argue, subjective experiences expose cognitive, affective, and social aspects of lived experience of precarity. When we began our research, there were primarily studies on subjective experiences and perceptions of gig workers in developed Western countries. We were curious to see how food delivery gig workers perceived platforms in the context of Latvia, because this is actually the first study who tries to understand how gig workers and food delivery gig workers are doing in Latvia. Platforms arrived in Latvia in a context where labor markets were structured by radical neoliberal reforms that began in the 1990s after the Soviet collapse. Compared to the Western countries where neoliberalism was adopted in the context of a solid middle class, the neoliberal reforms in the former post-Soviet republics, including Latvia, were installed in the context where a large part of society was economically disadvantaged. The post-Soviet labor market brought workers insecurities in the form of low wages, high taxes, and weak regulatory protection. Informal and shadow economies flourished, and wealth and income inequality has been high. In this context, gig work, often described as precarious work in the literature, did not seem more precarious than many other jobs available in Latvia, specifically regarding wage and overtime pay, ability to control one's schedule, and regulatory protection. A study on gig workers in Georgia, also a former Soviet country, done by Diakonidze and published in 2023, identifies a similar situation. Culturally, neoliberal reforms socialized people to think of themselves as solely responsible for their misfortunes and expected them to become more entrepreneurial. Additionally, neoliberalism, similarly to what Harvey observes, came in combination with ethnic nationalism, which has been disempowering to ethnic minorities and immigrants, as a result of which they have experienced limited access to labor markets. To answer our central question, we did semi-structured in-depth interviews, and in this paper, I rely on 56 in-depth interviews, which are done between June 2022 and December 23. We did purposeful sampling aimed at socio-demographic diversity because platforms did not share any data with us, so we don't know the socio-demographic composition of workers, so we aimed for diversity as it's usually common in qualitative methodology. And for recruitment, we try to access them through social networks and a lot also face-to-face on the street. The themes we addressed in the interviews were career trajectories and the choice of gig work. And so it means we also try to understand a little bit their biographies. So what was before they chose to do the food delivery work. Precarity and employment status, daily routine, and the work-life balance, algorithmic control and agency, subjective feelings about gig work, and cooperation with other careers and perceptions of social attitudes. And this latter theme we actually develop in another paper. So this is just to see the socio-demographic composition of the workers we interviewed. In the coding process and following the authors I mentioned, Armano and Miller observation, that lived experience of precarity reflects cognitive, affective, and social aspects. We typologize diversity of our respondents according to 3 dimensions: perceived range of alternative employment opportunities, temporal perspective of gig work, emotional orientation, which includes also, of course, job satisfaction. Based on these dimensions, we identified 5 types of gig workers in terms of their position with respect to food delivery work, but these positions also reflect different experiences of precarity. And this is a table where we reflect very schematically about all types we identified, but I will tell about each type a little bit more. So the first type is what we call in-between type. So as a result of the post-Soviet neoliberal transformations, youth in Latvia, as in other countries, increasingly have to pay for their studies, and they look for side jobs to ease the financial burden they or their parents have, or simply they want to feel independent from their parents, and this is an easy way to begin this independence. And across the globe, including Latvia too, it also becomes more and more difficult for young adults to follow linear labor market trajectories. So being a courier is seen as a good job opportunity to earn comparatively good income by looking for more stable jobs. But this type also refers to the adults. As labor markets become more flexible under neoliberalization, adults are also more prone to career shifts, and gig work is preferred due to its easy entrance and flexibility. In this type, respondents emphasize that this job pays comparatively well compared with other jobs they might take in Latvia. They also praise this job because it is readily available and offers great flexibility. The second type we call a temporary trap. And in this type, people choose this job because their overall situation in the Latvian labor market is precarious, meaning that it is difficult for them to access jobs due to the immigration regime, prejudice, and discriminatory practices. An international student visa allows working only 20 hours per week, and international students we interviewed told us employers do not prefer even interns with such limited working hours. The job applications are also denied due to insufficient Latvian language knowledge. All the international students we interviewed agreed that their other options were to do dishwashing in a restaurant, which is a very badly paid job, and it has no regulatory protection. Contracts are weak. Or another option is to be an online travel agent for US companies, but the latter option meant that they had to work at night because of the time differences, which was challenging to combine with their study. The third type we call a job, and a job type chooses this job because they perceive that being a courier helps with the overall precariousness generated by the neoliberal condition. By this we mean that workers from various spheres are expected to work more and more efficiently, are subject to high workloads, and often have hectic schedules that are difficult to combine with other care and fulfillment needs. Some also report high control and abusive work environment. In contrast, this job gives more sense of autonomy and agency. For example, the first quote is from a respondent who worked as an IT specialist before taking this delivery job. And his IT job was unpredictable in terms of schedule. So, for example, he said he could get an IT gig and it would take him 48 hours to solve. So it means he's not able to spend time with his family, not able to plan what's going on at home. And his employer was also not understanding about his needs and was kind of abusive. Thus it became difficult to combine such conditions with caring for his family. So he quit that job and he chose this one, and he was very skillful how to do this job to earn pretty well. The second quote shows that some do not like standard work relationships, but the relationships at all. So they want to avoid standard work relationships with tight schedules to pursue the pace of life they find enjoyable. Of course, they also recognize that to earn properly, you have to work long hours, but still you have some room to decide when exactly you are working, which would be not possible in conventional job. Another type we identify is a trap, and in a trap we locate two types of respondents. First, were forced into this job due to the financial neoliberalism in the post-Soviet space. Some of our respondents were insolvent either due to the 2008 financial crisis, when unemployment hit Latvia very badly and unemployment jumped to over 20%, and a lot of people lost their properties to the banks. At that time, Latvian state chose to bail out banks, but shrank the welfare programs. Or some experienced insolvency due to the unsecured loans they were not able to pay. For example, a single mom took a loan to pay the medical bills for her daughter, but later was unable to pay them back. And insolvency means that debtors are allowed to keep the state-defined minimum. The rest has to be given to creditors. Since couriers are independent contractors, it helps to avoid situations where debtors intervene in their relationships with employers, and sometimes make them feel bad about this. And this job also allows not to report some income and thus earn more, because one of the platforms we have in Latvia work on the basis on cash, so not only transfers. Second subtype in this type are those who are in a sense have been victims of Latvian nationalism. In post-Soviet space, neoliberalism combined with ethnic nationalisms that required Russian minorities to pass language tests in order to qualify for citizenship, and recently also for jobs. And these quotes are from a case of pre-retirement man who got laid off from a beverage company where he worked most of his life. After this layoff, he wanted to be a taxi driver, but could not due to the insufficient Latvian language knowledge, because to be a taxi driver, there is a requirement to know the language at a certain level. He tried to pass the tests, but unsuccessfully. And he feels he's forced to do this job he does not enjoy, and he feels that it is very precarious due to the high taxes he has to pay as an independent contractor. And the last type is the type we call lifestyle. This type or the respondents in this type embrace the precariousness of life, meaning that they are not looking for a permanent sense of security and protection. They prefer to shift from one temporary position to another. This type perceives life itself as a series of gigs. They feel that they have many opportunities in the labor market and want to explore and move on. Many are artists of this type. One praised the opportunity to meet celebrities and access fancy buildings, while another talked about the possibility to accessing couriers' WhatsApp chats as a source for performance. And they do not rationalize couriers' work in precarious terms, but in terms of opportunities. This second quote is from a young musician expressing his excitement about this job's flexibility. So these are the 5 types we identified, which shows like how diverse are actually people in this gig work sector in Latvia, and so it complicates how we can think about precarity and precariousness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Iveta, for your presentation. We will move on now to our discussant comments. Peter Thomas, who is, you can see him on Bob Jeffery's screen right now. All right, he has shared his presentation. And just a quick intro. Peter Thomas currently works at the Department of Psychology, Sociology and Politics at the Sheffield Hallam University, and his research is on class and social inequalities, welfare, work and employment, and education. And he kindly accepted our invite to provide some commentary to the presented papers and the broader scope of this issue. So, Peter, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks ever so much. And thank you, everyone. And thanks for inviting me here. Really happy to discuss these papers. And before I start, I just want to say, one, how important I think these papers are in discussing precarity and exploitation, and how interesting they are in the scope, as Bob mentioned, the different types of research processes that have been adopted, and the geographical scope we have. What I'm going to do today is try and pick up on some of the points that all three speakers' presentations made, make some observations that I thought were interesting, particularly from the two substantive articles on in Latvia and Bangladesh, and some thoughts going forward in terms of how we discuss precarity and precariousness. So I think starting off with Bob's points that he raised, and I won't spend too long on this, but a crucial feature I think that was raised by Bob and by this issue, actually by this special issue, is exactly how do we define and theorize precarity. And I think this has become an increasing issue in terms of what does it actually mean? Are we genuinely talking, as Bob mentioned, about work precarity, about contracts, and so on? Or are we looking beyond that? Are we talking about status issues? Are we talking about psychological issues? Are we talking about the amount of precarity that exists in terms of actual work-based precarity, or are we talking about feelings of precariousness? Because these are really important points and are hugely debated. Bob referred to Ķešāne, and also Manning has talked about that. Actually, Manning argues that work-based precarity hasn't actually increased, but at the same time, many scholars argue that feelings of precarity have absolutely increased, both in Europe and elsewhere. So these kind of things seem to be important. We've already discussed as well, both in the paper presentations, the need to think about geographical issues, the idea of recognizing potential differences of impact between global north and global south, and that historical global impact as well. Bob raised the point that a lot of our talk on precarity and how it impacts us in Western Europe is based on that relatively brief period of time between the 1940s and 1970s, when there was relatively secure work and full employment, predominantly for men. So still, even here, a relatively small group. But these kind of things actually strongly matter because they go back to ideas of how we perceive precarity, the psychology of precarity. Because what are we distinguishing between? If precarity is what's been experienced for most people around the world at all times, that might change not only how we perceive things, but how it's felt in our lived experience. In Hosna's and Ellen's paper, there's a great comment about conceiving precarity as not a nostalgia for a secure past, but an unachievable future. And I thought that was a great quote to show some of the different ways that precarity is perceived. And another key concept that was raised in the paper on Bangladesh garment workers is again another concept, this concept of hyper precarity. So when we're debating precarity, I think it's important to consider these various conceptions. Do we need to distinguish between precarity and hyper precarity, and indeed, as Bob mentioned earlier, ideas around work-based harms? I was struck in terms of the presentations, in terms of how in the special issue in general, actually, but particularly in the papers we've discussed as well, about this idea of conceptualizing precarity, both as a condition and as precariousness, as an ontological and subjective experience. And both papers as well, I thought, brought up interesting and important points about the linkage of institutional and cultural factors. So the ideas around the important framing and impact of neoliberalism, globally as well as nationally, but also those other national and regional factors, but also cultural factors in terms of Latvia, this notion of nationalism in ethnic frame and how that links with helping neoliberalism function. And in terms of the garment workers in Bangladesh, hugely important cultural norms and family expectations, and how that links in with both global neoliberal forms, but also relative lack of institutional support as well. So I think these factors were really drawn out well in terms of the papers. I was also in the articles interested in the different impact of temporal considerations, this idea of time and flexibility in the issue around gig workers in Latvia. This notion of flexibility and time was quite clearly seen as a positive factor for some workers, by all means, not all workers. But there was a much greater degree of choice, it seemed, for some workers in terms of their lived experience. And I thought that was fascinating, whereas quite clearly the notion of the global labour markets in garment work, the so-called pressure chain. I thought this was drawn out really well, this notion of the pressure chain and automation had actually very significantly intensified workloads. But precarity was also experienced in terms of domestic role. So in part of contrast to the Latvian example, we saw very, very limited choice, if indeed we can even talk about choice, issues around the double burden, as it was put in the presentation. Choice is made not by the women themselves, where choice was enacted. Sometimes it was a partner, a husband, deciding whether the garment worker continued to work or whether they should seek a promotion or not. So these kind of things I thought were particularly interesting. Some specifics on the articles themselves as well. I thought just on starting with the Latvian workers, or Latvia gig economy workers, I should say, in terms of the typology. I thought this was a really important contribution to the idea of identifying different types of experiences, of lived experience within gig economy work. And I'd be interested going forward in discussion, either here or elsewhere, about the potential applicability in other circumstances, so gig workers elsewhere, either in other countries, how this might apply to other sectors of precarious work. A fascinating element just on these particular workers in Latvia, the gig work experience, is in terms of the 5 types in between a temporal trap, a job, a trap, and a lifestyle. It was interesting to note that of the 5 categories, only one, a trap, was seen as a wholly negative emotional orientation. And I found that quite fascinating, because quite often in some of the literature, and indeed, as Bob alluded to, a lot of issues around precarity, rightly, are seen as hugely problematic for many people. And yet here there was quite a degree of seeing the positive side of flexible circumstances. Quite clearly reading through more of the examples and experiences, some of the background of some of those workers who engaged in flexibility, particularly those who saw it as a lifestyle, were either younger or clearly had wealthier parents or other resources, and appeared to have educational resource as well. And I think it's important to be aware of that. I'll come back to that point in summing up. I'd be interested in any discussion about whether there was any gender difference. It was noticeable in the sample. I think there were only 11 who identified as female, and most of the quotes, both in the article and the presentation, were predominantly the experiences of males, both positive and negative life experiences, and they were really interesting comments. But I'd be interested as well as in terms of the female voice here, whether they had very similar experiences or were there differences, and if so, what were those differences? In contrast to this idea of flexibility and choice that was exhibited by some Latvian workers, I thought what the article on garment workers really drew out was the absolute lack of security and lack of status and lack of ability to choose circumstances for these garment workers. For these garment workers, all aspects of their lives seemed in some ways a trap, either trapped by the conditions of work or trapped by social and cultural norms. It was drawn out very well how gendered norms permeated the experiences of these garment workers in terms of what they did, how they did it, even the conditions in terms of being able to take breaks was permeated by gender. The idea around toilet breaks and so on, and the limitations that the cafeteria on the 6th floor and things of this nature, but also how even issues around potential progression and promotion was a choice often taken by others other than the worker themselves, and how quite often they would deny themselves that opportunity, or it would be denied for them, particularly by husbands or other family members. So there were some clear differences, obviously, with the Latvian case, although it was interesting to note that migrant workers in Latvia as well were those who were more likely to experience negativity, as well as those in terms of the ethnic national issue. But I come back to that point of, do we, particularly when exploring the global south, need to distinguish between concepts of precarity and hyper-precarity? Finally, some thoughts, final thoughts going forward in terms of either this discussion and how we take research on. Bob mentioned it in his element, but to what extent is precarious work welcomed by workers? And how can we know this? Clearly, the Latvian presentation showed in some instances it is. So do we need to investigate more on which workers and how? Is it problematic if we see precarious work in a positive light? How can workers contest precarity? Is, again, alluding to something Bob mentioned, is something that in terms of the lived experience rarely came up. I'm not sure it did come up in some of the Latvian cases in terms of contesting precarity. So what are the barriers? There was discussion of unions in the case of Bangladesh, garment workers. But again, I'll be interested to explore that discussion a bit more. How do they operate? What are the constraints unions face? Quite clearly severe constraints, as was recognised by the death of a union leader in that in the Bangladesh article. Also, Bob talked about the breadth of methods in the special issue, and I would encourage people who haven't read the special issue yet to engage with all the articles, because there's some wonderful in-depth interview, ethnographic work, and so on, in capturing conditions and the lived experience. One thing I noticed going through all the articles, not just the two presented today, is a relative dearth of any primary quantitative analysis, and I bring this up as for something for discussion, particularly for academics, but not necessarily just academics. Is there a need or a role for more quantitative analysis going forward in terms of how we capture both the conditions and lived experiences of precarious workers and precariousness in general? So that's it from me, but I just want to thank all the presenters for some really excellent articles that I've really enjoyed going through. Okay, thank you.
Peter, thank you so much for your insights in expanding all these points, connecting all these intersecting topics. Let's move on to our Q&A section. We had a lot of points that I believe our authors want to expand on that were posed by Peter just now. We have only a couple of questions by our audience, so let's get through them first, and then I believe we can move on to some final remarks and a final discussion where the authors and also Bob as well can go back and forth with what was said, and these big questions that I also noted down that are left for discussion still. Firstly, we have a question by Hing Huang, who asks if the study of gig and precariousness, so this refers to Iveta's study, if the study of gig and precariousness in your research includes the criteria of formal contracts or regular work hours. I am wondering, how do we explore the concepts when labor contracts and regular work hours exist, but more with a purpose to regulate workers instead of protection? Iveta, if you want to read this question, it's somewhere in the chat as well, but go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it maybe refers to those situations where it actually also made us as authors of the study wonder how is it that actually this gig work, which is precarious in a sense by definition, because nobody guarantees you hours, nobody guarantees you a proper salary, how it is that it is better perceived than the work which has a regular contract. And I think it has to it can be explained with this specific context of Latvia, because what we and which is also in a sense sad, because our study, even though we studied particularly gig work, it exposed a lot more about the Latvian labor market, because we asked people about their career histories. So what happens in Latvian case, even if you sometimes have a regular contract, you are often exploited and expected to work more than your contract demands. And So the expectations are very tough, and in that sense, it also made people feel very precarious in their former employment positions. Well, in this work, even though they don't have regular hours, nobody guarantees them specific income, they felt actually less precarious because they had some control over their time. And this is important because this is another paper we wrote and which is coming out soon about the sense of autonomy, because we are actually in this capitalistic society and neoliberal capitalism, we actually see each other as worker primarily. So you see me as a researcher, not as a mother, as a friend, or as somebody who loves sing or dance. So that's one issue, because people are much more than workers, and but we live in, and specifically in this neoliberal context, that we are expected to do more, to work more, to achieve more, to show more result, and it actually dries us out and makes us feel very precarious. And for this reason, somehow, for some people, this job was a solution where they actually gained some autonomy in kind of a broader, in terms of broader sense of life. So not just autonomy of work, but how work, which actually itself is not so, doesn't give too much autonomy because of algorithmic management, actually gives autonomy in terms of life. I don't know if I answered maybe too much, but I tried to explicate what comes in my mind in response to this question. Thank you.
I believe so. There's another question for you. I'll pick it up now by Erica. She's curious whether you did any age-dependent differentiation of the participants. For example, how do attitudes toward gig jobs differ between generations? From her experience working precarious jobs, the attitudes of her generation, which is Gen Z, are much more disillusioned and passive compared to older workers. And she's wondering if this is also the case for you.
I mean, yeah, there are some gender differences. So there was a tendency that, for example, in this in-between type, there were more young people, but nevertheless, there were also adults who are in between jobs, and they were in their 40s and their 50s. But in this job type, which was like somebody who is actually looking at this job as a serious job, he sees he could do for a longer time. So we actually did not see so much very young people, because young people that, okay, this is for some period of time and then I will move on and do something else. But in this job type, there were actually adults in their 40s, 50s, and even 60s who felt this is a job I can do for a longer time. So there are some differences, but since it's not a quantitative study, I cannot be so secure about these tendencies. But this is what I see, that in this in-between type, there seem to be more young people, where in this job type, we did not see so much young people. And also this lifestyle type, where actually you don't embrace life as precarious and you see many opportunities, which I thought this last type, a lot of artists were there. So these were also mostly young people. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'll divert now and point a question to Ellen and Shewly. This is a point that was made by both Bob and Pete in their presentations. You also speak about trade unions in your paper. So let's raise the big question of how can workers contest precarity in these contexts, and what barriers are there for these efforts, if you want to pick up on this.
Nice to respond. Ellen, or what me? Okay, thank you, Bob, and also Peter, for a very illuminating discussion on both the papers. In relation to the protest, labor protests actually occur time to time, but it's something always been responded very harshly by the state for several reasons. Firstly, it is one of the thriving source of becoming the so-called developing country speed things, and one of the main force for the income of the country. Secondly, the businessmen, the RMG workers, RMG business owners are also politically involved. They also are involved with the political parties, so they are also very much powerful. And then third, any protest against for example, not increasing the salaries or the work issues, it's always been responded as conspiracy against the country. So it's always considered as like a foreign conspiracy, rather than addressing the grievances of the workers. So in that way, it has always been somehow never capture kind of bigger issue to respond. But still, sometimes they make those things. Labor unionization, it slowly starts its pace, but it is not strong yet. It is also divided into various politics within themselves. It is also more gendered. It's like it's a lot of time to invest for being unionization, and for this kind of woman being such already time constraint, being part of this labor union is also one of the issue. And it is also hiddenly those who try to involve in the union, they do not really stay in the jobs sometimes. So all these things really affect, and the issues of precarity is really consist in all ways, but still it is, people are always out on the street, even sometimes like after 3 months they do not get their salary. So these things create issues and they come out on the streets, but hardly their issues are being addressed. What else? The issue of precarity and hyper precarity. We didn't put it in a like oppositional concept or like the precarities or hyper precarity. Rather, we use the term hyper precarity to show how it is actually affecting the women from all different dimensions, creating added layers of grievancing and affecting their lives. Social, work, family, personal, and also ethnic issues. So that's why we felt it shows the profound uncertainty that affects people. That's how we think. In other way, I would personally say I think we need more and more bringing into going things that flows over various kind of categories that we already have, because real life is much more complex, and it is not something like one or two categories can explain things the way it works. I think I end here.
I don't know if anyone else wants to pick up on this topic. I think there's one other lingering question that we can tackle in this conversation before any of you wants to do some final remarks or speak about something that you wish to be still addressed. But I believe that we can tackle the question, and I've wrote it down exactly as Bob did in his slide. So what determines whether flexibility is a benefit or a trap? Who wants to take this one up? It was targeted at Iveta firstly, but anyone can. Yeah, Ellen has yet to speak.
I can start.
So go ahead.
Yeah, obviously it depends on context. So as I really like that you pointed out this notion of being trapped. It came in your paper, Iveta, but also the Discussant, you raised it again. And we also wrote another paper about female migrants, and especially those in the garments. Also, they although they leave their villages out of economic desperation, they also have a lot of aspirations entering the paid employment. And then when they found out that their employment is not paying them well enough, they end up in these traps. So in their context, I don't think flexibility is is understood by many of them, not their work is not understood in a positive term, although we also interviewed women. No, we should look at it, we can look at it in different ways. There are also, the women are not in the sense trapped in that they cannot leave their factories. So women, they move from factory to factory. So they may be trapped in this kind of work situation as garments workers, and it may be difficult to leave that employment type, but they do move from factories to factories. And we also see a lot of women who choose particular types of factories because they offer them certain advantages. Sometimes a very good factory is not so good for them because they have to do a lot of overtime, and they're not in a position to do it because they have kids at home, for example. So, but yeah, so there's flexibility within the inflexibility, you could say, but it's not in the way that it's celebrated as in Iveta's presentation.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, I can just add that I also agree with Elena that this whether flexibility is a benefit or a trap, it really depends from the situation of a worker, and it actually, that situation can change over time. For example, in this job type, which was also a kind of surprise for us, that we actually came across some gig workers who had very good education. Some of them even had studied abroad, and actually Latvian labor market could benefit so well from their knowledge. But because they were at a stage in their life where they developed a family, or they developed some of them even a kind of began to develop a small business, they were not able to pursue these goals at the conventional workplace. So this flexibility the gig work offered for them was a benefit in that sense. But yeah, like for others, it might be also a trap. For example, this actually the type we call a trap, they actually in a way like this political and economic conditions forced them to do the job they do. So they actually, because of insolvency or because of lack of Latvian language knowledge, they are not able to find the positions, stable positions they would like to. And they are forced to do this gig work where they don't have a regular contract. They don't know how much they will earn at the end of the month. They can still control it, but maybe it requires from them too many hours that it makes them tired. So in that sense, yeah, it's more like a trap than a benefit. But in that sense, it's not a choice, you know, they had to do it. But for some, it's really a choice, and they benefit from that. Yeah. Thank you.
Just to briefly add on, I think for our case, it's like a bit of more of like aspiration and desperation traps, where the women actually move from one to another.
We have a follow-up question to this conversation right now by Ying once again. He said, this seems to be a discussion of agency when we discuss the choice and motivation in precarious work. From your point of view, how would this agency be sustainable when the choice is limited? We could be here for a while.
Yeah. It always helps me to think through the cases. I mean, even thinking of the trap case in terms of gig workers, so those people who were forced to take this job because of insolvency process or because of this limited language knowledge. In terms of this in insolvency particularly, I think what happens, one of the platforms, I did not tell him that in presentation because I felt not enough time, but one of these platforms actually allow to work with cash, so you don't do the transfers. And what happens, one of these respondents who actually he used to work for big Swedish companies as a leading manager, but then the 2008 crisis came in and he lost his job because the companies left, and he lost his properties to banks. And the insolvency process at that time was that he still owes a lot of money to the banks, even he does not have any of that property anymore. So, and what happens, like every month, the state have defined that he has to pay certain amount from his salary back to repay his debts. And so in this sense, the money the state leaves to him is so little, he's not able to properly care for his family. He has 3 kids, one from the previous family he lost due to all this 2008 nightmare. And now he has a new family with 1 kid. So he actually needs more money, but the state requires to give him a lot to these creditors. So what happens that this option to work for a platform which allows you to earn in cash gives him agency, because he is able not to report all his income, which leaves him with more money on hand, and he can support his family better. So this is a kind of, I mean, in a sense, maybe it's not an easy agency and an easy situation, but in the context it is an agency for him. So just like one case which comes in my mind to respond to this question. Yeah. Thank you.
We don't have any more questions by our audience. I don't know if anyone of you wants to rehash a point that is still needs to be addressed. If they want to do any type of final remarks, this would be the time to do it.
Well, I would like to make a small remark. What I really liked about the call for papers was that there was the emphasis on the global supply chain. And we've looked very much now today at the national context. And we also argue that the state in Bangladesh, for example, plays a very important role. But it is also super important to look at the international dimension. And the whole point that Mark Anner articulated, that it's really from the buyer side that the real squeeze starts. But then the sort of precarity is delegated to the lowest bottom, and it's out of our sight. And I think it's really important that we bring it back into also our sphere of responsibility. And maybe that's my activist perspective, but it's really important. Then maybe that's also why it makes sense to talk about hyper precarity, because it shows that there are different sorts, and also across the world, across the globe, we can really differentiate. That's what I wanted to just add to the discussion.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank the organizers of the special issue. That was, I think, a really great chance for us all to come together. And many thanks to Bob and Peter for the questions you raised today. So I really noted them down. So it's again a new process to think through all this. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. And I guess I just had a couple of final remarks as well. I mean, one was around the potential for resistance. So, I mean, speaking as an academic, but also an activist and a union organizer, I think certainly in countries like the UK and the global north, but I think as we get from some of Hosna's comments, perhaps some parts of the global south, we have a union movement that is not always responsive to the needs of marginalized groups of workers, that is not always responsive to the ways in which the working class has been transformed over the last half century, not always responsive enough to women, to minoritized ethnicities, to young people. These are groups that are seen as too difficult to organize, and so the kind of left out of the traditional trade union movement. But I think certainly in the UK, but I'm aware in other countries, we have started to see the formation of new types of union organisation that are specifically focused on these kinds of workers, gig workers. I could give the examples of the IWGB and the UVW in the UK. So I think it's thinking about how forms of political organisation can help to overcome some of those challenges. I think my second comment, very much linking to Ellen's remarks, is that, you know, yes, and these papers have brought this out really well, that precarity is very context specific. It depends upon political economy, it depends on the gender order. But at the same time, we can identify some universal tendencies within neoliberalization to drive down welfare state, to impose austerity, to privatize, to open up markets, to increase poverty and inequality. And if part of the task is around building global solidarity in order to contest these issues on a global scale, then the first part of that is having this dialogue and learning from each other and learning about the similar processes that are playing out in these different national contexts. So in light of that, I think this special issue has made a contribution to that debate. I want to give my heartfelt thanks to the presenters today, Iveta, Ellen and Hosna, but also to the wider contributors to the journal and to the team at Social Inclusion for helping to make it all happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you for all your presentations. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you to all the attendees who joined us. We also worked a bit overtime today, and we went a bit off the time that we planned, but we still had a lot of people bringing questions, a lot of participation. The conversation could, I believe, go on for quite longer. So that is what we expect from these types of sessions. So let's wrap this up. All I have to tell you is that this recording will be available pretty soon on our YouTube page for your consultation and for you to share with someone who could not attend today or to revisit the conversation. All of the papers presented today, as well as the whole special issue, is available in open access in the Social Inclusion website. And I hope to see you on our next webinar on the Social Inclusion series. Tomorrow we'll have a webinar on intersectional threats to social inclusion. It will happen at the same time as this one, so 4 p.m. CET. And I wish to see you all there. Thank you so much for joining us again, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, everybody.